Welcome to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. I'm Daniel Murphy, Assistant Editor of the Journal. If you are new to these podcasts, please visit the Florida Historical Quarterly on Facebook, where you can now access abstracts of each article and the current issue of the Journal. Today's podcast features an interview with Dr. Sam Watson, who authored an article titled Conquerors, Peacekeepers, or Both, the U.S. Army in West Florida, 1810 to 1811, A New Perspective, which appeared in the summer 2013 issue of the Florida Historical Quarterly. In today's interview, Sam and I discuss his article and recent research on the West Florida borderlands.
Tell the audience a little bit about your background.
Well, my name's Sam Watson, and I've just been promoted to full professor of history at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And I have been at West Point for 14 years now.
Let's go ahead and get to the interview, and I guess the first thing I'll ask you to do is, can you briefly describe West Florida during the years 1810 and 1811?
Well, it was a tumultuous, disordered period. The white settlers in West Florida, mostly Anglos or Americans, rebelled against Spain during the summer of 1810. Remember, this is when Mexico is also or Mexicans are also rebelling against Spain, and it's really the beginnings of all the Latin American revolutions against Spain. And there had been unrest and especially uncertainty among the West Floridians for a long time, not knowing would Spain be able to provide an effective government to promote economic development, stability, peace, security, prosperity. And these settlers decided to take things into their own hands and create their own republic. There's basically three alternatives at the time, and one is that West Florida might become an independent republic, and perhaps endure as such until the present. Another is that these rebels might join the United States, as did occur. And then third, though probably a lot less likely, that the British might have intervened, and certainly that would become more likely during the War of 1812, when the British do land at Pensacola, land at Mobile, land at various points along that coast.
So, to say the least, a very dynamic and chaotic place.
Yeah, definitely dynamic. How chaotic probably depends on your perspective. For the settlers and for historians who focused more on the settlers or the rebels, they probably see it more as this is an opportunity for us to assert our independence with a lot of Republican, small R Republican values and ideals, and we're going to have self-government, at some level, greater self-government than under Spain. And perhaps also some of the security and prosperity that might come with joining the U.S. The Spanish, of course, are unhappy about all this, but the United States is a little bit ambivalent in the sense that the Jefferson and the Madison administrations had wanted West Florida, basically as much as they could get of West Florida, all the way to Pensacola if they could, as part of the Louisiana Purchase. The U.S. is seeking stability, or the U.S. policymakers, the administration, wants stability, and it wants stability on its terms, which aren't necessarily quite those of the settlers and the rebels, particularly, say, the deserters, right? The U.S. eventually gives them an amnesty, and so it kind of settles that issue. But there are always land claim issues, right? And there's the Spanish claims and how the Spanish have structured land titles versus the potential of American law, and those things are always tortuous and hard to resolve.
Well, you mentioned other historians. Readers of the FHQ will be, more familiar with this topic than maybe some of the others, in the sense that the fall 2011 issue, we had a special issue devoted to the West Florida Revolt of 1810. How did the articles in that special issue influence your research?
That was really the catalyst for my article. I had written part of a chapter on the Army in West Florida back during my first sabbatical in 2006. At the time, I was focusing in my writing on the Army on the frontier before the War of 1812, and then my publisher said, wait a minute, you're supposed to be writing about the Army on the frontier after the War of 1812, and so I backed away from that. But I had 10, 15, 20 pages of kind of core material and archival evidence written up. And I'd given a paper on it that summer at the Society for the Historians of the Early American Republic. But then after that, I went to work on things after 1815 or after 1810, resulting in the publication of my books this last year. When I saw the special issue come out, I thought, oh wow, huh? I have a little bit on this. I should look at this. Maybe I should do something. Maybe I can contribute something here. And then I had something distinctive to offer because the articles in the special issue were largely about politics and society, and they were largely from the perspective of the West Florida settlers and the rebels. So seeing that issue made me think, hey, here's a discussion going on, and I have something I can contribute to it.
Before we return to the interview, I wanted to mention that individual issues of the Florida Historical Quarterly are available through the Florida Historical Society for $20 each. Inquiries should be addressed to Dr. Ben D. Brotemarkle, Executive Director of the Florida Historical Society, who can be reached by phone at 321-690-1971 and via email at ben.brotemarkle@myfloridahistory.org. That is ben.brotemarkle@myfloridahistory.org. Also, please tell us if you are a podcast subscriber.
The focus of your article is the U.S. Army. Was the role of the U.S. Army in this situation significantly different from its role in other regions, comparable regions, or incidents during the same period?
Well, my work as a whole argues that we have to look at not just ideology and motivations and outcomes, but we need to look at and really explore the processes in between, the connection between the cause and the effect. In the last 30 or 40 years, we have actually maybe begun to neglect the nation state a bit, and the nation state is most powerfully embodied in the Army, and in this case, what was actually a national standing army. A lot of people think of the early United States as an era of decentralization, and maybe they think of the military, they think of militias, but the Army is the most powerful representative of the United States as a nation on the frontier. What I'm looking at is these national agents, people who represent the United States, but they're on the spot. They used to, in British imperial history, they used to refer to them as the men on the spot, who are necessarily, they have to kind of interpret national policy and interpret it to the people living in the region. They kind of have to mediate that policy, to explain it, and try and get the local people on board with it, hopefully without using force. So there's an amount of gun-to-boat diplomacy. It's the Army, of course. Part of its power is the threat of coercion and the intimidation. But what they really are is a sort of diplomats. My original title for my book was actually going to be Frontier Diplomats, and the press didn't really like diplomats so much. I guess that didn't really fit with Army as well. They definitely like Jackson's Sword and Peacekeepers and Conquerors a lot better, but I was happy I could get the Peacekeepers part in that because the conquest side, using the military force is really the last resort if the intimidation or mediation or negotiation, persuasion fails. The Army's role in West Florida, I would say, was pretty similar to its role elsewhere on the early national frontier. It was upholding U.S. sovereignty, national sovereignty, pretty much against everyone, against the Indians and the Spanish in the sense of conquering them or driving them out or taking control of areas that they lived in or claimed, but also against white frontiersmen in the sense of maybe preventing them from going too far, attacking Spain, getting the United States in a war, or preventing them from attacking the Indians, without cause and getting in a war with the Indians, which would cost the United States financially, and taxpayers in the East would be upset by that. So they're really performing this kind of balancing act where, yes, of course, they're attempting to promote U.S. expansion, and they believe in U.S. expansion, but a lot of them don't really trust the local people, the people in a region, because they do have, the Army officers, they serve the nation as a whole, or they think of themselves serving the nation as a whole, through the constitutional authorities of the executive branch and Congress, whereas the frontiersmen have their own motives, alternative republics, like, say, West Florida, to develop and be independent, and then maybe be a cause for European intervention. Their vision of the Union, you see this in Peter Onuf's work and James Lewis's work, their vision was that if the Union could be sort of as large as possible and incorporate all these small republics of the states or the territories becoming states, that then they could all work together within this, what we today, the Constitution really creates like a national free trade zone, or, as large as our country is, almost a continental free trade zone, with pretty much a common set of laws. And this would minimize conflict and minimize opportunities for European intervention, minimize instability, and maximize the opportunities for the nation to develop. So everybody, all the Americans, all the white Americans, agree on what they want to do, but how they're going to do it and who's going to do it and who's going to be in charge, and I suppose probably at some level who's going to benefit from it, who's going to benefit more from it, those things are all in question. And that, to me, it's important at getting that intermediate level.
And you've kind of already addressed it, but does the U.S. Army change as a result of what happened in West Florida, or are there changes that in other ways that result from the Army's participation in West Florida down the line?
Well, the major long-term consequence of the Army's intervention, or if you prefer the United States intervention in West Florida, was annexed into the United States. And some scholars think that was likely anyway. Others, and you can see this in the special issue, other scholars think that there was more of a desire for an independent republic in West Florida, but the United States pretty much takes that option away by intervening with military force. And initially there's a little bit of resistance to that among the West Florida rebels. Most of them had wanted to join the U.S., but wanted to join the U.S. on their own terms. And so one way or another, West Florida is now part of the United States. In the process, the Army is also reducing some of the social disorder and some of the violence. There were some of the militias, the rebels who then formed militias, who were then moving to attack the Spanish, but there weren't enough farmers, there wasn't enough agricultural surplus to really supply, to feed dozens or hundreds of men roaming around the countryside, camping, trying to intimidate the Spanish over a period of several months. And so a lot of these groups essentially turned to marauding. They would forage, which ultimately means looting. Go to somebody's house, and maybe they had money, maybe they pay. If they didn't have money, they were hungry, they didn't pay. And the Army helps to repress that, either by actually arresting some of these guys, or having arrested some of them, intimidating the others. So the U.S. intervention, which of course the Spanish don't like, right, and ultimately kind of brings a conclusion to the West Florida Rebellion. Kind of sets the framework for the future development. West Florida will, for example, not be a state. It won't be an independent republic. It won't be a state. It'll be divided between Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama, and in parts Florida. And that, I think, is crucial and something that might not have happened, or might not have happened in quite that way.
You have so much information in this article. I think FHQ readers are going to get a lot out of this. Thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Oh, well, it's been a delight to talk with you all.
Thank you for joining our international audience for this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. The Florida Historical Quarterly is the peer-reviewed scholarly journal of the Florida Historical Society. The Society was founded in 1856 and is the only statewide historical organization in the state of Florida. The Society is headquartered in Cocoa, Florida, and the editorial offices of the journal are in the Department of History at the University of Central Florida. I hope you have enjoyed the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast and that you will consider supporting future scholarship on Florida history by becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. In recognition of the quincentennial of Ponce de Leon's first visit to Florida in 1513, the FHQ is publishing a series of 6 special issues, each devoted to examining Florida over the previous 5 centuries. Beginning in 2013, a special issue will be published each consecutive year, with 2 in 2016, that provides an overview of current interpretations and evaluation of historiographic trends relevant to the period being covered. We look forward to receiving your feedback on these special issues and other future volumes as well. We also invite researchers to access back issues of the Florida Historical Quarterly on JSTOR. Thank you again for listening to the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast. If you enjoy listening to this interview and know of others who enjoy history, please tell them about the podcast and have them find us on Facebook.